So yeah, just a huge welcome. It's so lovely, these faces popping up, and you can see that people are, people that perhaps couldn't join previously because of timings are here now. And I can see Canada and New Zealand and the UK, and it's really, really wonderful to have such a huge collection of people here. So I'm just going to say something very briefly about PhEmaterialisms. I'm assuming that most people have some working knowledge of who we are and what we're doing and why we're here. But just suffice to say that we are an international network of feminist academics, artists, activists, researchers, and we're coming together because we share a sense of purpose around wanting to make a difference in the world, and by mobilizing theory in our work. So it's about the making use of theory in our doings, and so that our research, our scholarship can make a difference in policy circles, in practice circles, in pedagogy, and in the world writ large. So prior to all being locked in our houses, we used to meet in person and have a really lovely time, and we did that twice, in 2015 and then again in 2018, and that was in London at UCL and Middlesex. And since then we've had to be quite flexible and adaptable, and we have this Facebook group which I think is now well over 1,000 members, and many of you will have come to know about us and be part of us from that Facebook group. So given the constraints of COVID living, we decided to attempt to put this, our activities, our doings, in a virtual space. So here we are all in boxes. But what we've endeavouring to do through this PhEminar series is to ensure that it is still active, and it's about participation, and it's about community, and it's about sharing. So this is the third seminar now, they're monthly. And we are absolutely delighted to have Julia Coffey with us, who is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Newcastle, Australia. It's very early in the morning there for her. And we're delighted that she's run away from her family and managed to get into her office and share her work with us. Her work draws on feminist new materialist approaches to understand gender, youth, and the body. And her latest book, Everyday Embodiment, Rethinking Youth Body Image, will be published later this year with Palgrave Macmillan. So I'm not going to take up too much more time or space, because I want Julia to have the space to share her work and to engage us in her doings and to participate actively. There are 2 Padlets running, which are designed to work with Julia's intention for the session, and I think some of you have already populated it with images. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Julia, and yeah, welcome.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks to the PhEmaterialisms team. I'm so thrilled to be joining you today, and it's sort of it connects to the last PhEmaterialism that I was at, which was in London in 2015, which I can't believe was almost 6 years ago. And yeah, this is really a development of the work that I shared and the ideas I was having at that first event that was held. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here. And I'm really grateful that you guys are still, I know how awful it is being on your screen all day, and I know that's what you guys are all doing at the moment. So yeah, thank you for being here. I feel very honoured. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the Ourimbah campus today, which is on the unceded land of the Darkin young people in Australia, and acknowledge that, yeah, this land was never ceded, and that, yeah, we have a really strong tie here at this campus with elders and some emerging leaders as well. So it's a really important part of where I'm coming from today. And I'd like, this is sort of generally the overview, I guess, of where we're going today and what's happening. So I'll talk to you about the project that these ideas work into and relate to. with obviously some theory like Jane was mentioning, and how I'm weaving that through into the technique of photo voice, and then perhaps what it potentially does. And I'll illustrate that through a couple of images from the study. And then I'd like to use the Padlet and any of the images that you have taken. This is entirely optional. If you want to participate in this, that's great, but it's, you know, it's not required at all. It's certainly not required to share anything at all. If you would like to, it's of course there for you to do that, and that would be great, but it's completely optional, because images can have a lot of effective power. They can, you know, produce things that we might not want to be produced at that time. So it's really up to you. So when we get to that aspect of looking at images or discussing images, I think we'll create some breakout rooms so that you have the opportunity to talk things through in a kind of more, a smaller space, and then think about if there's anything you'd like to share to the larger group. And we can, you know, talk through more generally perhaps about what you feel the method might do or might not do, or your own kind of engagement and enactment of, the kinds of things we're talking about, or I'll be talking about. So I'll do a sort of presentation for a little while, and then we'll hand over quite soon to being able to talk through in a more participatory, engaged way. So to set the scene, I'd like to share some experimentations with photo voice as a technique to explore the dynamic and vital processes by which bodies take their place in the world. So the work that this is based on is from a project that I've called Everyday Embodiment, which started out as a pilot project 6 years ago, which basically tries to reorient the problem of youth body image as a broader question related to the conditions of possibility for embodiment formed through the diverse relational circumstances which form a life. So it's really a sort of a theoretical reframing of notions of body and image that Rebecca Coleman and other feminist sociologists and new materials thinkers have already begun. And I'm just trying to find new ways of working through those broad or large philosophical questions into the everyday and the physical bodies of the people I speak to through my research. So it's oriented by feminist new materialism, of course, that's why I'm here, and more than representational or non-representational styles of theory and research. So, of course, this perspective directs me and others to look at the ways that material things act on and with us to produce human practices, as Carol Taylor and Gabrielle Iverson have said, in an effort to account more fully for the complex processes by which social realities come to be and could be otherwise. So this is the premise of PhEmaterialisms, as Jane introduced, and this collection of work in seminars to foreground and recognise what Brad calls the ethico-onto-epistemological relationality in all research processes, and to be responsible in how we move through the world and the techniques that we use to explore it, and to sometimes intervene or shift the focus on what matters and bring forth new potentialities, hopefully. So it's oriented to trying to bring forth things. And that's, I was speaking to the others before the seminar about how things are really being called forth at this particular moment in time in Australia in relation to gendered violence, all kinds of histories of patriarchy and colonialism. And these things are very at the front of mind for myself and for, I'd say, pretty much every socially justice-oriented feminist in Australia at the moment. We will be marching on Monday, and it's going to be I hope it's an interesting historical time that we look back on. So just to situate with a theoretical quote from Brad. So bodies, it's a very well-known one, bodies do not simply take their place in the world. Rather, environments and bodies are interactively constituted, and the ontological and epistemological standpoint of the researcher mediates and affects interactions between all aspects of the research phenomena, including method, data, participant, and researcher. So it's in this engagement, interaction, and entanglement that ethics become a crucial performative element. So that's I think where the call to doing responsible research comes from the PhEmaterialism perspective. And that's what I'm trying to think through today in this project and the examples I'm going to talk about. Yeah, so to have an ethical obligation to interact responsibly in the world's becoming, to contest and rework what matters and what's excluded from mattering. So I'm very conscious of that and really feeling, not just conscious, very feeling that in my body at the moment in terms of what matters in the world is being brought out into the open in quite a new way in Australia, generally, the kind of moment that we're in. So I use this orientation, drawing on these feminist new materialist approaches, to orient a particular direction for exploring what's happening to produce well-being and body image embodiment in this project that I'm describing today. So I'm approaching it as an emphatically embodied phenomenon, and I think research on the body and trying to understand how it's lived, how it philosophically is situated, and what it does is my main call to wanting to use these approaches. It's the body is fraught. Bodies are fraught ways of trying to create knowledge often, or they have been historically, in terms of how philosophy has understood bodies as, relatively passive, overcoded, just absorbing passively sociocultural norms, but it's so much more than that, as we know. So it's trying to take account that complexity and that complete exceeding of representation that bodies are and what they do, that orients what I'm trying to do with this theoretical approach and through the method or the technique of photo voice. So that is why I'm looking at the body as an active force, to try to give that voice and to try to see what happens and what comes forth if that sort of crucial first move occurs. So visual methods, which of course is where photo voice comes from, again, historically, traditionally prioritise images as producing stable representations, or relatively stable ones, of reality or identity. But others have started the work, which I'll look at in a second, of reorienting to create and engage more than representational readings of images and bodies. So this sort of draw to be more than representational rejects the privileging of human existence over other non-human objects and adopts a more experimental approach to research, taking material discursive entanglements of interacting phenomena like places, bodies, all of the potentia of life, basically, architecture, clothing, historical situations, contexts, others, as the focus of interest. So this approach, as Carol Taylor says, locates the image as a cultural artefact constructed in relation to social norms, values, context, and processes, rather than offering a window into a pre-existing reality. So that's, I really want to make sure when I'm sharing my images that, we're going beyond the sort of mirror image of reality that can be sort of simply presented and known. It's trying to understand the processes that make something to be. So this approach also draws on Rebecca Coleman's feminist sociological account on the materiality of images, and draws from Deleuze's concepts of the body and affect as a way of usefully reorienting the place of images to understand embodiment as an affective process. So bodies, as Coleman says, become in and through their affective and immanent relations with images, rather than images as forces which ideologically simply impose on bodies. So this is obviously important to how I'm trying to theorise the broader issues of what is popularly known as body image in the book and throughout other work. So the point is that what an image might produce cannot be known in advance. Images must be studied as effective processes of relations and as potentials rather than simple mirrors of reality. They can suggest intensity and vitality and have the power to affect and provoke. And it's the potential of that power that I'm wanting to sort of really engage in and focus on. So like all methodologies, Higgins argues, and Mark Higgins has done some really, really important sort of foundational work in terms of reorienting and situating what can happen next with this particular technique, I think. So it can be open to reconfiguration through a differential entanglement of theory, practice, and ethics. So it can be done or enlivened otherwise. And this is one of the questions I came to trying to figure out way back in 2015 when I was thinking about what images do and how they can be, how focus on images and photo voice can be, you know, activated or oriented in a way that is, you know, congruent with the aims of post-human or feminist materialist approaches. So it's important to unsettle the traditional constructivist underpinnings of this particular method because, yeah, usually it is seen as being a way of kind of producing representations of experience that are then, you know, produce knowledge about a knowable subject. So Mark Higgins has stressed the importance of acknowledging the situatedness of photo voice within a research project and talking about relations of power between different elements and people in the process. And he refigures it through Indigenous conceptions of praxis, emphasising it is an ecology of relationships. So it's I guess the grounding is that photo voice becomes about much more than the individual and about much more than the person taking the image. It's about the process of engagement which enables that image to be taken in the first place and all of the sort of on-flow aspects of a life and embodiment, including all of those multiple aspects, ineffable, unsayable aspects often of life to be sometimes surfacing. And that's what some of the examples I hope will show. So obviously there are two sort of issues in photo voice. One is the representational kind of history and legacy of images, and the other is that of voice, which of course Mazzei has really gone a long way to destabilize through post-human methodological approaches. So obviously in the field of visual studies, voice and in photo voice has been overladen with humanist properties of a present, stable and authentic self who's able to sort of, you know, have this singular, unproblematic sort of voice that can just be unlocked and enacted and can just be known. But rather, Mazzei says that voice can be seen instead as a negotiated process involving competing agendas, imbued in power relations, and reframing it to become a becoming that emerges through a complex network of human and non-human forces. So I'm trying to just orient it towards being more than and having the additive dimensions of the theoretical premises that I'm coming from. So if the images and the sort of status and possibility potential of images is sort of rethought in the first place, then it sort of starts us on in a different place for looking at what images can do. And if you start from the beginning that images themselves are potentially aleatory in being able to open up new aspects or having an unknown potential possibly able to come forth, then I think in that particular circumstance, it can be really useful to look at the embodied and complex, difficult to articulate dimensions of everyday life, and particularly for embodiment. So I'm trying to attempt to blur well-being as an individual property, trying to think self and embodiment as in motion, as in process, contingent, emergent, and inviting the on-flow of life, felt and registered in the body, as sensation, memory, imaginary spaces, elements, weather, relationships, all of these things come through in the images to be reconsidered as part and as an important way of how embodiment and well-being is produced and assembled. So participants in the study took so many different images. This is just an overview of some of them. This is not all of them. This is mainly just from a few participants, all of these ones. Not all participants took images as well. Some weren't able to, or weren't in the right place to be able to engage with images because of past trauma or because of just not feeling comfortable, all those types of important ethical dimensions. But obviously, you can see some Instagram, Fitspo type images are in here, some gym workouts, sunsets, bedrooms, kitchen cupboards, the beach, friends, food bowls, inspirational quotes, coffee, friends, all kinds of different aspects that I'm not saying all of these, start from the perspective of being, more than representations. Often these are taken as ways to show me something that's going on and in a way that's relatively stable and, in alignment with the rational humanist subject, but others certainly go further in the way they were produced and taken, and they can always be situated as more than those representations too, of course. So I'm trying to look at the ways that these go beyond those knowable representations to being traces or moments, partial traces of well-being, partial traces of embodiment, to look at how this method can actually be part of that performative doing. So the images I want to talk about today are the ones that are more about the process and engagement of what moved someone to take a photo or what moved someone to take an image, because some participants, really talked about that when we spoke about the images. Others sort of tended to take one to discuss photos with me that they had already arranged into a folder of pre-existing photos, based as just what was on their camera roll. And I guess that's sort of like the scroll back method that Robards and others in youth studies use. But the ones that I think are most aligned with the perspective of photo voice we're talking about from a feminist and materialist perspective are those that did sort of actively engage in taking a photo because they recognised or registered a feeling in a moment, which then that was the moment they pulled out their phone. And I think that intervention, or not intervention, but that kind of way of surfacing something and then being able to discuss it or get into that space is a really interesting dimension of this technique in particular. So this broader study that all these images are from, as I said, are from the study of how body and well-being are co-produced through the affect, relationships and general circumstances of everyday embodiment. So because I'm not going right into all of the background of these images and how they're situated in against others, that's something I can do in the book and in other articles. Just wanted to say they were the sorts of questions and prompts that people were discussing to make sense of this. So, whoops, Daisy. So this is from a participant, Steph, and I've used her example in a paper called Ugly Feelings as well. But I really like this example because she's using the image as a way of showing or engaging a different kind of quality of discussion or a different kind of understanding or knowing of what happens in that moment of feeling something about the body in terms of negative self-appraisal or judgment. So she said she realized that she was looking in the mirror and doing this, like she's showing us, looking at my weight and body and stuff, and I thought I should take a photo. I thought, wow, this is actually it. And because she'd been talking about how she had been really trying to have more sort of positive orientation to feeling about the body through studying feminism in university, and through kind of becoming critical of sexualization discourses and you know, what causes culturally this body concern. But she said, yeah, the invitation to kind of try to be aware of moments that related to well-being for her meant that she registered this as one of those moments. And she was one of the first people I spoke to, so I asked her about what it was like to you know, take photos of that, and she said it was fun. I don't know, it was like a creative way to express myself. I really enjoyed it. I think it was definitely moments, as in her feeling of what the sensation or dimensions of what well-being could be was registered to her in moments. It's not something that, like, if I was to purposely try to arrange, I wouldn't even represent how I felt at that moment where it popped into my head. Like, this is what it means kind of thing. I liked doing that. But when I first thought about taking photos of well-being, I was thinking food and exercise and things like that. But it wasn't all that. It was the feeling in the moment kind of thing, not just the visible thing that you think of. It's hard to capture. So I think this is a really useful way of how kind of impossible the task of representing the complexity and embodied aspects of a life, and particularly related to embodiment, how sort of flawed a representational only kind of approach is, even in the first place, because it just doesn't enable the felt dimensions of these issues to surface. And I think she's articulated that really, in a way that's quite theoretically apt herself. So I think here too, you can see the smartphone operating as an important apparatus or post-human player, as E.J. Reynolds and Gabrielle Ivinson have talked about. And, you know, that particular technological affordance in all of our lives as and potentially a useful dimension of photo voice as well, in that we're always carrying and mediating the world through these devices as well. So she did take lots of these other images were from Steph, this participant, that were in that more kind of representational domain of this is me doing this is me doing that, and all together they kind of created a very rich kind of layered understanding of her life and how she registered and mediated well-being, body image, embodiment concerns within the broader conditions of her life, which is the overall kind of aim and purpose of what I was trying to access or get into. So I talk about the sort of the gendered aspects of body concerns in the other paper. If you're interested in, you know, we can talk more about that if you'd like as well. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving on to the other images. So I love these two pictures from a participant, Jared, who he was, unlike lots of the other people in this study, he was working full time. He was a fitter and turner. Most of the people I spoke to were kind of first in family to go to university, and, you know, located around this campus that I'm in, which is a particularly interesting area in terms of, you know, having lower levels of postgraduate and university education, high levels of you know, domestic violence in the community, high level of Aboriginal, Indigenous populations, and a very otherwise white population. So this interview with Jared was one of the kind of more difficult ones, just because there was not that kind of even flow of conversation that can happen, because I think he felt he was on the university campus. It was like the power dynamics were really there, and that I'm getting older, so the age gap was there as well. So it was just, we were kind of speaking from different places, but the image, and when he started speaking about the images he created, everything changed. And I think potentially from a, you know, ethical kind of creative perspective, that there is something in that, of course, being invited to participate creatively in something and be able to drive that process yourself in terms of choosing what to show, how to show it, and, you know, guide the conversation themselves, I think is a potentially really useful thing. So this is what he said about it when he started. I asked, did you take any photos? And he said, yeah. I first read the description. I started taking photos of everything, washing the car, fixing the letterbox. He didn't give me the other photos to use. He just sent these two that I'm going to show. And he said, this was just a dumb inspirational quote thing that I randomly wrote and then felt childish about. It's just the back of my car. Probably doesn't make sense. The next one is the interior, the inside of my car. That's my dash. But we didn't really talk about the text that he overlaid in his image. So he brought that, he'd taken the photo through Snapchat and, you know, wrote what he called a dumb inspirational quote over the top. But I think it's poetry. I think it's poetic, and I think it's incredibly affective and powerful. So it goes beyond just trying to understand well-being as, you know, a state that can be achieved or attained. It involves driving as a, you know, a way of escaping and creating movement, and yeah, just a different tone of conversation, a different thing to surface that I still have trouble describing. So this is the other photo that goes with it. So he says, or the image says, because he didn't say this to me in the interview, without your head being clear, it can get shit. It certainly can. And being overwhelmed with things to do, uncertainty how you're going to squeeze every dollar so you can pay all the bills. Choice wouldn't be clear, but changed to the mood you're in. And he talked about stress throughout the interview and financial difficulties, wasn't being supported. Even though he was living with his dad, it seemed like he was supporting his dad financially, and that there was certainly a difficult relationship that didn't hold the kinds of security and safety that we often expect if, you know, students or people are living at home. But he says that driving afforded an escape from this pressure and from the clutter. And it enabled a kind of a whole broader understanding of driving and movement. And, you know, it really made me feel like I knew I could understand and feel like what it was like to be in the car, moving fast, driving around those windy local roads that I know. And I think it really does get at the embodied affective dimensions of the practices that we don't normally code as well-being practices, you know, self-care. This is, I think, a really important dimension that I think was surfaced because of the particular method or technique, but not always, just the potential for it to surface, I think. So the images themselves, I think, open potential for Jared to communicate in a new way, like I was saying, rather than sort of breaking out of that narrative, linear kind of way of communicating, like interviews, textual interviews often can. And yeah, enabled new things to come forward beyond the stilted back and forth rhythm of conversation, question and answer, and enabled new ideas and new relations, for me anyway, to be brought through and brought forward. And he also used this as a way to sort of make a statement about mental health, which he did in the context of these photos. He used this as a bridge to be able to say, mental health is the most important thing in my generation. I've seen my friends' lives be ruined, people's lives are wasted. And he just sort of just started moving and you know, using the space differently and in a way that really, I think, disrupted and did something to the otherwise quite hierarchical relationship that was between us, that of course I was not wanting to be there. It's been really difficult to move past that. So I think that these techniques can enable the, you know, the messiness and the kind of weird aspects of everyday life to register, and feelings in moments to become known and to matter differently, and to come up in ways that we might feel, you know, we might recognize, but it's often the unsayable kinds of aspects that are the most, it can be the most important depending on the issues. So these techniques only aim to offer traces of these life worlds, but I think they can be really useful in efforts to mobilize other ways of doing, other ways of being, and new potentials for living. So now I think I've basically made the points I wanted to around ethics of encounter in feminist new materialist research, what potential techniques might do when oriented from the perspective that we're all, I think, wanting to come from, and for the ethical and political importance of doing such work. And yes, that what these things produce cannot be captured as any certainty or just, you know, guarantee particular outcomes, because images and techniques themselves cannot do that. Effective perspectives are not about trying to present something as known in the first place, or even potentially knowable, but just create new ways of intervening and new potentials to come forward. So I think that's where I'd like to leave it. But what I might ask you, if you'd like to do now, would be to, because I'm doing my screen sharing, I haven't been able to look at the Padlet, but if you would like to move into some breakout rooms, if you have an image to discuss, if you feel comfortable discussing it, that would be great to do that in the breakout room. Or you could just talk about any kind of responses or reactions generally to the theory or any aspect of the things I've talked about. But I think if you are talking about someone else's image, perhaps don't ask them questions about it. Let someone maybe give them the space to speak and say what they would like to say about it. Don't probe, just let them say whatever they'd like to, and you could perhaps ask, is there anything else you'd like to add? But, you know, just so it's not like an interrogation. It's just an open, non-judgmental sharing, I would suggest. So think about what moved you to take an image in the moment. Why did you take it? Was it related to well-being, or was it just because you felt something? What did you feel? What was going through your mind? Does it connect to histories, dreams, memories, conversations? I'm someone whose dreams tend to kind of permeate their day. They're always threading back through in weird ways. And think about what did you do next? I think is a good way of trying to capture how these things go through, not capture, but, surface how these things go through and weave through